So, good afternoon. Going to continue our exploration of the four foundations of mindfulness and this dance of mindfulness and movement as we explore the second foundation, which is Vedana. I like to repeat a bit of what Pat said earlier in what the Buddha said, which is within this fathom long body and mind is found all of the teachings. How we know the teachings is through our experience of them. And Vedana, uh, this small but mighty component, this area of inquiry is really strongly represented in a number of the teachings. Throughout the teachings, it's emphasized. It's the second foundation of mindfulness, which is what we're exploring this weekend. It's the second of the five aggregates, which really speaks to the literal mechanism of experience, moment to moment. It's the second of those five aggregates. And it's the seventh link in the 12 links of dependent origination. It's the link between contact with the world, and craving. So to know Vedana, to move in, to zoom in on the experience of Vedana, is to be really close to that place where we begin to crave or not go there. It's often overlooked in our day-to-day lives and in our experience, and even often in our practice. We're so accustomed to moving to um, the next thing as opposed to seeing what might be feeding it, what might be actually contributing to it. So it's a very powerful pause to be with this subtlety of the foundations. It's so powerful that it's worthy of its own foundation in these teachings of the Satipatthana Sutta. It's worthy of its own foundation because that's how important it is in understanding our suffering and our release from suffering. It's the literal linchpin or link that helps us understand that from our direct experience. And we're not conditioned to noticing it because our conditioning is really around the mechanism of the mind and all that goes with that. You know, when we're watching the news, for example, our thoughts can be heavily focused on what's right, what's wrong, our opinion about it, our feeling about it, our activation about it. Uh, but we're not always in touch with the unpleasantness of experience that might be operating underneath it, the operating system that's underneath our response to what's happening. And that's the territory of Vedana. It's like what's underneath the sheets of our experience that we're often running and in the thick of. So we're asked with this foundation to discern a number of things. One way to look at this is this sense of discernment is that in this fathom long body, there are six sense gates we've got. And then there's six sense objects that they're in relationship to. So the eyes see. The sense object is sight. The sense gate is seeing. The sense gate is ears. The sense object is sound. The sense gate is this body, and the sense object is touch. There's the sense gate of the nose and the sense object of smell. And there's a sense gate of the mind, and the sense object are our thoughts and our emotions. And when the sense gate and the sense object meet, there's contact. And right in that contact, simultaneous with that contact, is a sense of Vedana. And that contact, that Vedana, is either pleasant, it's unpleasant, or it's neither pleasant or unpleasant, kind of neutral. When the Vedana is pleasant, one of the things we can begin to notice is that when we're enjoying the Vedana, we tend to want more of it. And this leads us to the poison that the Buddha talks about of greed. We want more. Well, I had that piece of chocolate, but a second piece would be better, right? When the Vedana is unpleasant, and again, we can know the Vedana or not know it, we can not be aware of it, but when it's unpleasant, we tend to want to stamp out the experience, make it go away. We have aversion to it. We have ill will about it. And when the Vedana is neutral, what we tend to do is zone out, or we become bored, or we spin into some sense of fantasy. It's also a place where we can be confused and fuzzy. We just can't quite formulate an experience. Something's happening though that we can feel. We can feel the tone of something, but it's not quite crystallized in our mind. We tend to recognize and be more in touch with pleasant and unpleasant Vedana because it has a lot more juice and association with it. We can usually tie it to something familiar or a story or some interpretation. It's not so much the case with neutral Vedana. With neutral Vedana, sometimes we just fast forward through the experience. And yet neutral Vedana could actually be where we begin to feel into a sense of ease uh, or openness or spaciousness. I think because we don't have a relationship with neutral, it can become a very terrifying place. Like the place we get into where we think something's about to happen because an extreme is not operating. Neutral is also the place that we enter often when we are kind of letting go of some intensity, something known. As it's dissolving, we might feel more of a loosening that then can become frightening because we're not acquainted with it. In the race work that I do, I remember being at a conference that I was a keynote at, a psychology conference in Baltimore many years ago, and I was inviting it was an African American Black psychologist conference, and I was inviting the people there to. I asked them the question, "Who are you if you're not in the struggle of race? Who are you if you're not in the struggle of race?" And one woman near me, just before she knew it, had began to talk. She said, "I would lose a big part of my sense of identity if I wasn't talking about race, if I wasn't in the aversion of race." Right? So these are habits of mind sometimes that we tie ourselves to. The unpleasantness and the absence of the unpleasantness can be really jarring for some of us because we're so accustomed. Our conditioning centers around it. What life is is centered around it. There's the two arrows that Buddha talks about really fits nicely in Vedana, an understanding of Vedana. The two arrows is we have the initial arrow that creates a level of suffering. Something happens and we have, let's say, a feeling about it, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. That's the first arrow. Something's triggered through one of these sense gates and sense objects. The dance of that triggers something. We feel a certain Vedana about it, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. First arrow. The second arrow is then looking at our relationship to that. So we tend to add more suffering to the first arrow because of how we're relating to it. We add a layer of story to it. Memory comes in, our preferences, our likes and dislikes, flood into the experience, creating a morphed, kind of distorted exaggeration, elaboration of the first arrow. Sometimes I talk about it like if you were to see a kid hit by a car, a hit and run driver, would you run after the driver or would you go to take care of the kid? Taking care of the kid is the first arrow. Running after the driver, is kind of like the second arrow. Not that you shouldn't run after the driver, but there's something immediate that's beckoning. And this happens in our experience. Sometimes we get hit with a memory or a trauma or something grabs our attention, and then we latch onto it and we grind into it. And we're not always aware that we're suffering in that moment. We're not aware of the Vedana. We're more contracted around the story of why it shouldn't be here, rather, our preferences around it. So Vedana invites us to pause to recognize the operating system that's underneath our reactivity, underneath our preferences, our leaning, our movement in our lives. It also, to recognize Vedana is to notice and interrupt, if you will, some of the habitual inclinations of the heart and mind, to question them, to slow it down and question them. Especially because oftentimes these impulses lead to craving. So there's a story, I think I first heard Joseph Goldstein telling the story by Billy Collins called The Barking Dog. And it's an example, I think, of how we can interrupt the Vedana that's kind of in full speed ahead. So the neighbor's dog will not stop barking. He is barking the same high rhythmic bark that he barks every time they leave the house. They must switch him on their way out. The neighbor's dog will not stop barking. I close all the windows in the house and put on the Beethoven symphony full blast, but I can still hear him muffled under the sound, barking. And now I can see him sitting in the orchestra, his head raised confidently as if Beethoven had included a part for barking dogs. When the record finally ends and he is still barking, sitting there in the oboe section, barking, his eyes fixated on the conductor who is entreating him with his baton while the other musicians listen in respectful silence to the famous barking dog solo. That endless coda that first established Beethoven as an innovative genius. So it's that's a way of interrupting the Vedana. It's a bit elaborate, I agree, but it's a way of seeing that how we relate to that second arrow. The dog barking is the first arrow, annoying, painful to the ear, perhaps. But then our story about it, they must have turned him on when he left, and this is personal, and he's barking, and he's all of that is extraneous Vedana. And this practice of Vedana invites us to cut through our storyline and just name pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Is it pleasant, unpleasant, neutral? Let the storyline fade in the background and get bare bones with the experience. It keeps us out of the spin of the second arrow. What we find in practice with Vedana is that the Vedana is always changing. It's not like it's one thing all the time. It's always changing. And there's a sutta that speaks beautifully to this, the Sky Sutta, the Akasa Sutta. And it goes like this. In the sky, practitioners, that's all of us, various kinds of winds are blowing. Winds from the east, west, north, and south. Winds carrying dust and winds without dust. Winds hot and cold, gentle and fierce. Similarly, practitioners, there arises in this body various kinds of Vedana. Pleasant Vedana arise, painful Vedana arise, and neutral Vedana arise. It's always changing. And freedom lies in noticing this kind of ceaseless phenomenon without preferences. Can we notice the Vedana without preferences, without interruption? That's part of the practice. Without reactivity. Can we be with the winds of change that Vedana makes available to us? So Vedana invites us to do something simple in a way. In a word, is basically asking us to name what arises in this fundamental way, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. To be with its constant shifts. So another way of discerning this quality of Vedana. Vedana is not the sweetness of a cookie, but rather if the sweetness is experienced as pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. See? Some of us like chocolate. I can't understand why some of you wouldn't like it, but that's my Vedana. That's my preference talking. So it's not the sweetness of the cookie. Rather, it's the sweetness, if the sweetness is experienced as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Vedana is not the sound of the music we're listening to here, but rather we experience the sound as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. See, the music that we're hearing here is sound before it's music. When we hear the barking dog, it's barking before it's noise. You see? When we add a spin to it, we add an interpretation to it, we add a layer to it. We add a story about it. So with Vedana, we want to stay close to the first arrow of our experience, that place of contact, before contact turns into preference, before contact turns into a judgment. We can just name it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, and see what becomes available to us. So with practice, we can deepen our experiences beyond our preferences. You know, we cannot be in the false refuge of thinking that, for example, a good meditation period, a good sit is when I enjoyed it, or when my mind didn't disturb me. You know, that was a good sit, which is different than being with what's here, uh, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And one of the things I like about the practice with Vedana, which has been I've been hanging out with quite a bit over the last few years because of the work I'm doing with race and helping people slow down the experience, because race in and of itself is not um, um, a problem. But when we add the second arrow to race, all of the ways we've been conditioned around it, then we're in a whole nother territory. We're in a territory of conditioning and reactivity, and often defense and terror. But if we can develop a relationship with Vedana, I find that we can sit with the disturbance a little bit more, anchor ourselves within it, see it as unpleasant, and without that layer of reactivity, without the added arrows, maybe we can find a different way to respond, where we're not in reactivity, we're not in our place of defense. So we can change the word of race and add any other words you like. It's the same dynamic of us seeing if we can slow down our experience enough to feel this pivotal link in the chain of causality that links us more to suffering or to freedom, if we can pay attention to it, if we can develop a relationship with it, if we can allow it to have its nature, which is to come and go. So as we move into this next movement period, one of the things I'm wanting to invite is a sense of being with we're looking at the sense gate of ears and sound, and being touched by that, and then seeing, opening to what the Vedana is that is arising, and then giving that expression. The expression can be subtle or elaborate. You'll know what that is. So it's as if the whole body is an ear as you listen to the music and move. You're being touched through the contact. And if it's pleasant, show that. If it's neutral, show that expression. If it's unpleasant, see what that extension of your inner experience might be in movement. And mostly, I don't want you to think much about it. You can kind of just have this softly playing in the background of your mind and just step into whatever experience is here for you. So I don't want you thinking, working at it, but allowing yourself and allowing the movement to open you into the experience of Vedana, not to go searching for it so much. Again, Vedana is not the sound of the music, but how the music is being experienced. I invite you to keep that in mind. But don't think about anything I've just said. None of it. Don't think about anything.